So imagine a modern CEO, right? They step up to the microphone at this highly anticipated shareholder meeting.
Oh, setting the stage. I like it.
Yeah, I mean, the room is completely packed. The cameras are flashing everywhere. But instead of, clicking to a slide showing record-breaking profits or unveiling some flawless new product line, this leader does the unthinkable.
Right.
They just throw away their glowing Ivy League resume, they pull out their therapist's notes, and they just begin reading aloud their most humiliating public failures, with
Wow.
their deepest insecurities and their absolute worst performance reviews.
I mean, in our world today, the stock would absolutely tank.
Oh, completely. They'd be fired before they even left the stage, right?
Without a doubt.
But the crazy thing is, 2,000 years ago, an ancient thinker used that exact counterintuitive strategy to completely conquer the influencer capital of the Roman world.
It really is just a stunning reversal of expectations.
Right.
We are so conditioned, to believe that authority requires this unbroken facade of strength.
Yeah.
But the document we are looking at today, it fundamentally dismantled that idea for an entire culture.
And that is exactly what we're getting into. Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. Our mission today is to really unpack a single, remarkably dense document.
Yeah.
It's Chris Arvelas's survey of 2 Corinthians. We are diving into this ancient letter written by the Apostle Paul, somewhere around AD 55 to 56.
Right.
And we need to establish right out of the gate that this is not, some dry, theoretical textbook.
Far from it.
It's this raw, emotionally bleeding letter. It deals with status obsession-like, the ancient equivalent of influencer culture bitter rivalries, and the kind of public humiliation that feels shockingly modern to us today.
I mean, the underlying tension of this entire text revolves around one really simple question, right?
Okay.
How do you actually define legitimate leadership?
Exactly.
In a society that measured a human being's worth by their wealth, their rhetorical polish, and, who they knew, Paul comes in and argues that true transformative power only operates through profound human weakness and suffering.
It's wild. So if you listening to this right now, if you've ever felt completely exhausted by the pressure to curate a perfect image,
Which, let's be honest, is everyone.
right, whether that's maintaining a flawless aesthetic on social media or just projecting invulnerability in your professional life, you are going to find this deep dive incredibly relevant.
Absolutely.
Today, we're going to tease out that paradox. I'll be pulling out the historical drama, the surprising archaeological facts, and the narrative tension from the survey.
And I will do my best to help us decode the ancient social mechanisms, the original Greek terminology, and the broader theological worldview that's really shaping this text.
Perfect. So to understand why Paul's message was so scandalous, we really have to start with the environment he was dropping it into.
You have to. You just cannot comprehend the radical nature of this letter without understanding the physical and psychological landscape of ancient Corinth.
So let's build that world. The survey paints a picture of a city that was basically the beating commercial heart of the region. Physically, Corinth sits on the Isthmus of Corinth. For those picturing the map of Greece in their heads, there is this large southern peninsula called the Peloponnese,
Yes.
and it's connected to the mainland by a very, very narrow strip of land. Corinth sits right on that choke point.
And that geography, I mean, it dictated its entire destiny. It served as the primary commercial bridge between the Aegean Sea to the east and the Adriatic Sea to the west.
Because sailing around it was a nightmare.
Oh, completely. Sailing around the southern tip of the Peloponnese Cape Malea was notoriously dangerous. The storms there were brutal. Shipwrecks were incredibly common.
So instead of risking the open ocean, these ship captains would pull into the eastern port of Corinth. And here's where it gets absolutely wild.
The engineering marvel.
Yes. They wouldn't just unload the cargo. The Corinthians had built something called the dialkos, which was essentially this paved trackway spanning the entire land bridge.
It's so impressive for the time.
They would actually haul the physical ships, or at least, the massive loads of cargo over land on wooden rollers to the western port, just totally bypassing the dangerous sea journey.
It was a massive economic engine. And because of this constant funneling of trade, Corinth was just flush with cash.
Yeah, big money.
Money, luxury goods, and people from all over the empire were constantly flowing through its streets. You had merchants, sailors, artisans, traveling philosophers.
Bureaucrats.
Right, bureaucrats, all of them colliding in this relatively confined urban space.
And it wasn't a traditional old money Greek city at this point either, which I found fascinating in the survey.
No, not at all.
The Corinth that Paul visited was actually a Roman colony. Julius Caesar had refounded the city roughly 100 years earlier.
Right, around 44 BC.
And he populated it largely with Roman freedmen, so these were formerly enslaved people who had been granted their freedom and were looking for a fresh start.
And that historical detail right there is what explains the specific social psychology of the city.
How so?
Well, old Greek cities, they had these entrenched, centuries-old aristocracies. But Corinth was a boomtown.
Oh, okay. Like a gold rush town.
Exactly. It was incredibly upwardly mobile. It was filled with people who had started with absolutely nothing and made an absolute fortune.
Right.
And this created a hyper-competitive, deeply status-obsessed culture. The social fabric was defined by immense wealth, but also these razor-sharp class distinctions.
I picture it as this really intense intersection of like Wall Street and Hollywood.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
You have the hyper-capitalist, cutthroat drive of Wall Street, layered with the absolute obsession with public image, celebrity, and, who's who that you find in Hollywood.
Yes.
And the engine driving all of this was the patronage system.
The mechanism of patronage is so crucial here. I mean, in our modern context, if you donate to a hospital, your name goes on a plaque, and maybe you get a tax write-off.
Sure.
But in the Greco-Roman honor shame culture, public benefaction was basically a blood sport.
A blood sport.
Well, yeah. If you were wealthy, you were expected to fund public buildings, host these lavish games, or distribute grain. But it wasn't out of the goodness of your heart. It was highly transactional.
Right. You buy a building, you buy a constituency.
Exactly the mechanism. In return for your financial outlay, you gained what they called clients.
Okay.
These clients were socially inferior citizens who now owed you public loyalty. They were expected to show up at your house every single morning for the salutatio, the morning greeting.
Like kissing the ring.
Basically, they had to physically walk with you to the forum just to make you look important and to praise your name publicly.
Wow.
Your total worth as a human being was visibly quantified by the size of the entourage following you around the city.
It's quantifiable clout, literally. Followers in real life.
Exactly. Real-life followers.
And into this melting pot of ambition, you throw religious pluralism. The survey notes this dizzying mix. Traditional Greco-Roman cults, traveling philosophical schools, these secretive mystery traditions, and crucially, the imperial cult.
Where the Roman emperor was actually worshipped as divine.
Right. Plus, a thriving Jewish diaspora presence. It was just a marketplace of ideas where everyone was shouting to be heard.
And we know this isn't just theoretical background. The survey highlights specific archaeological discoveries that anchor Paul's relationship with this city into verifiable bureaucratic history.
This is the part I love.
Methodologically, when historians approach ancient texts, they look for external anchors, right? Epigraphic evidence that can tie a floating narrative to a specific calendar year.
And for Corinth, the holy grail of that epigraphic evidence is the Gallio inscription. I really want to dig into this because the mechanics of how we reconstruct history are just fascinating.
It really is.
This inscription wasn't even found in Corinth. It was found in Delphi. It's a fragmented letter from the Roman Emperor Claudius carved right into stone, and it mentions a specific man, Lucius Junius Gallio.
Right. And Gallio was the Roman proconsul of Achaia, which is the province where Corinth served as the capital. The reason this fractured stone at Delphi is so monumental for biblical historians is that the inscription firmly dates Gallio's term in office to a very narrow window, right around AD 51 to 52.
Which perfectly locks into the narrative timeline we have from the book of Acts.
Exactly.
Because Acts chapter 18 records that during Paul's very first visit to Corinth, which was a stay that lasted 18 months, he was dragged before the local tribunal by his opponents to face the Roman proconsul. And the text specifically names that proconsul as Gallio.
The alignment is just striking. It gives historians a fixed chronological peg.
Yep.
We don't have to guess when Paul was wandering around Greece.
You know for sure.
We know with remarkable precision that he was planting a Corinthian church in the early 50s. It takes the text out of the realm of abstract myth and just drops it onto the hard pavement of the Roman administrative calendar.
Speaking of hard pavement, the survey brings up another incredible archaeological find, the Erastus inscription.
Oh yes, the Erastus pavement.
In 1929, archaeologists uncovered a Latin inscription carved right into a paved square near the theater in Corinth. It reads, Erastus, in return for his aedileship, laid the pavement at his own expense.
Now, an aedile was a highly prestigious municipal officer. They were responsible for public buildings, commercial regulation, things like that.
Okay.
And it was a role that required massive personal wealth, which perfectly aligns with that patronage culture we just discussed. Erastus literally paved the street to cement his public honor.
But the twist, and this is so cool, is that in the biblical book of Romans, which Paul is widely believed to have written while staying in Corinth, Paul passes on a series of greetings at the end of the letter.
Right.
And one of those greetings is from a man named Erastus, whom Paul casually refers to as the city treasurer.
The intersection of the biblical text and the archaeological record here is highly suggestive. Now, the survey wisely cautions that establishing an absolute, unquestionable identity between the Erastus of the pavement and the Erastus of Paul's letter is methodologically tricky.
Because names could be shared, right? Like there were multiple guys named Erastus.
Exactly. But the probability is incredibly high.
Yeah.
And the implications of that are profound.
Because it proves that the early Christian movement wasn't entirely composed of just the absolute lowest rungs of society.
Precisely. It illustrates the plausibility that high-status, wealthy civic elites were actively participating in the early church,
Right.
which of course introduces a massive social problem.
I can imagine.
If you have wealthy patrons like Erastus sitting in the same house church with enslaved people and day laborers, the toxic hierarchical patronage dynamics of the outside city are inevitably going to bleed into the church community.
Yeah, you can't just leave that culture at the door. Now, the survey does note that direct physical archaeological evidence for first-century Christian or Jewish meeting places in Corinth is relatively sparse, but it also clarifies that this is methodologically normal.
It is entirely expected. In the first century, Christians didn't build massive stone cathedrals.
Right.
They met in the private dining rooms of wealthier members. So they left no distinct architectural footprint.
Makes sense.
But the lack of a building doesn't invalidate the community's existence, because the architecture of the city itself, the forum, the pagan temples, the merchant stalls, all of it perfectly corroborates the complex social reality these letters address.
So if you take Paul, a guy who makes a living working with his hands as a tent maker or leather worker, a guy who openly talks about his suffering and absolutely refuses to play the status-seeking game,
Right.
and you drop him into this hyper-competitive Shark Tank, an explosion is inevitable.
Oh, completely.
And that clash of values sets the entire timeline of their rocky relationship into motion.
The chronological narrative matrix behind 2 Corinthians is incredibly volatile. To understand the emotional weight of this letter, we have to map out the sheer amount of relational trauma that occurred between Paul and this community.
Let's track that timeline. So we start with that initial 18-month visit, anchored by the Gallio inscription around AD 50 to 52. Paul establishes the community, he works alongside them, and eventually leaves to continue his travels. But the moment he leaves, things start falling apart. The culture of Corinth just takes over.
It does. The community fractures into competing personality cults. They literally start suing each other in the Roman public courts.
Yikes.
And the wealthy members start humiliating the poorer members during their communal meals. So around AD 53 to 54, Paul, who was writing from the city of Ephesus across the Aegean Sea, sends them the letter we know today as 1 Corinthians.
He writes this brilliant, complex theological letter to correct their behavior. But, and this is the crucial turning point for our document today, 1 Corinthians completely fails to fix the problem.
It really does. And that is a hard reality for people to grasp sometimes.
Yeah.
This masterpiece of early Christian literature didn't immediately work. The tensions remain unresolved, and in fact, they escalate.
It gets worse.
Much worse. By AD 55 to 56, the situation deteriorates so badly that Paul is forced to drop everything in Ephesus and make an emergency trip across the sea to Corinth.
And the survey refers to this as the painful visit. The text doesn't give us the exact play-by-play, but the emotional fallout is massive.
We have to imagine this in the context of an honor-shame culture.
Right.
Paul arrives expecting to exert his authority as their founder. Instead, someone in the community openly defies him.
To his face.
Right to his face.
Yeah.
They publicly challenge his leadership, and the rest of the church just stands there and lets it happen. He is deeply humiliated.
The psychological mechanism of that moment is just devastating. In a culture where your public honor is your literal reality, being publicly defied and undefended by your own friends, that's an existential blow.
Absolutely.
Paul is so wounded, and the situation is so toxic, that he realizes staying will only make it worse. So he retreats, he leaves abruptly, and sails back to Ephesus.
So he's sitting in Ephesus nursing this massive relational wound, and instead of going back, he writes, the survey calls this the tearful letter or the severe letter. He writes it out of absolute anguish.
The agony of writing that letter must have been immense.
Oh, without a doubt.
He is writing to people he deeply loves who have just completely betrayed him, and he knows this letter could either save the relationship or sever it permanently.
And the agonizing part for historians is that we likely do not have this severe letter in its original complete form.
Right, it's lost. But we know he hands this explosive document to Titus, his trusted coworker. Titus is tasked with being the ancient mail carrier, the mediator, and the peacemaker.
A tough job.
Very. He sails off to Corinth, and then Paul just has to wait. Think about the psychological torture of that. Today, we send a risky text message, and we stare at the 3 little dots on the screen waiting for a reply.
And even those 30 seconds feel like an eternity.
Exactly. Paul had to wait months.
And the anxiety practically leaps off the page when he recounts this later. He is so distressed waiting for Titus that he can't even focus on his work.
He just abandons his post.
He does. He leaves Ephesus, travels north to Troas, still finds no peace there, and literally crosses the sea into Macedonia, desperately pacing the Roman roads, hoping to intercept Titus on his way back.
Finally, in Macedonia, the reunion happens. Titus arrives, and he brings a remarkably positive report.
The best possible news.
The severe letter actually worked. The Corinthians experienced genuine remorse. They disciplined the person who had publicly defied Paul, and they desperately want to restore the relationship.
The wave of profound relief that washes over Paul in that moment, that is the emotional catalyst for such a Corinthians.
Okay.
He sits down to write this document, to express his joy, to officially restore relational trust, to explain the nature of his ministry, and to prepare them for his impending third visit.
But this brings us to one of the most fascinating literary debates highlighted in the survey.
The unity debate.
Yes. Because when you sit down and read 2 Corinthians straight through, it does not read like a smooth, perfectly outlined essay. The tone is erratic. And because of this, there is a significant scholarly debate over whether 2 Corinthians is actually one unified letter or a composite.
Like a Frankenstein document.
Exactly, a document stitched together from multiple fragments of different letters by some later editor.
It is a really vibrant debate in biblical scholarship. The minority view argues strongly for the composite theory. They point to incredibly jarring tonal shifts.
Give me an example.
Well, the most famous example is a sudden, stark warning about holiness and avoiding partnerships with unbelievers, found in chapter 6, verse 14 through chapter 7, verse 1. It feels to some scholars like it just drops out of nowhere and interrupts the flow of his thought about reconciliation.
And the ending is even more extreme. I mean, for 9 chapters, Paul is incredibly vulnerable. He's joyful. He's relieved. He's talking about comfort and generosity.
Right.
And then you turn the page to chapter 10, and it's like a different person took the pen. He becomes intensely defensive, bitingly sarcastic, and frankly, quite severe. The whiplash is intense.
It really is.
I can completely understand why an analyst looking at the text centuries later might assume someone just glued the end of the lost, tearful letter to the back of the joyful letter.
That is the exact mechanism the composite theory proposes. However, the survey points out that the mainstream, dominant view among scholars remains that the letter is a unity.
Okay.
They argue that the structural jarring isn't the result of clumsy editing, but the result of complex rhetorical strategies and real-time emotional shifts.
And I have to push back heavily on the composite theory here, just based on human psychology.
How so?
Well, we just mapped out a relationship that is fundamentally traumatized. Paul is riding a massive emotional roller coaster. He's deeply relieved about Titus's report, yes, but he also knows that the people who caused the problem are still lurking in the background.
That's a great point.
If you've ever had a massive relationship-threatening fight with someone, even after the initial makeup and relief, the anxiety and the defensiveness don't just magically evaporate.
No, the wounds are still fresh.
Right. So the abrupt tonal shifts feel far more like the natural cadence of a passionate, brilliant guy dictating a highly charged letter over the course of several days, rather than some later scribe cutting and pasting papyrus scraps.
And that psychological reading is precisely how proponents of the letter's unity understand the text.
Yeah.
The letter isn't a sterile theological treatise meant for a textbook. It is pastoral triage. It moves sequentially through emotional beats, from comfort to apology to profound theological reconciliation to a call for tangible generosity and finally to self-defense.
Because he has to deal with the lingering threat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The reason he pivots so aggressively in chapters 10 through 13 is because he has to address the looming threat that is still in the city.
The antagonists. The survey introduces them with this brilliant, sarcastic title Paul gives them, the super apostles.
I love that phrase.
It's so good. Who exactly were these guys who had invaded his church?
They were rival itinerant teachers who arrived in Corinth sometime after Paul's initial departure. And what made them so dangerous is that they perfectly embodied the Corinthian cultural ideal we outlined earlier.
They fit right in.
They played the game. They arrived with impressive letters of recommendation from other important figures. They possessed elite rhetorical polish. They likely charged high fees for their teaching, which, ironically, in that culture, proved their worth.
So they were the ancient equivalent of the slick, highly polished keynote speaker with the best-selling book, the verified checkmark on social media, and the perfect stage presence.
That is a perfect modern equivalent.
They looked the part, and they look at Paul, a guy who refuses to take their money, who works a grueling manual labor job, who isn't a polished orator, and who constantly gets arrested, beaten, and run out of town, and they tell the Corinthians, you're following a loser.
Look at his life.
Exactly. If God were actually with him, he'd be successful and powerful like us.
And the mechanism of their argument was incredibly persuasive to a Greek mind. To the Corinthians, visible suffering was proof of divine disfavor.
It meant the gods hated you.
Right. The conflict wasn't just a petty turf war over who was more popular. It was a fundamental battle over the very definition of the Christian message. If the super apostles were right, then the message of a crucified Savior was just an entry-level stepping stone to worldly success, wealth, and power.
But Paul's response is what makes this document an absolute masterpiece. If I'm Paul and these guys are attacking my resume, my first instinct is to pull out my own credentials.
Naturally.
And he had them. He was highly educated, a Roman citizen, deeply trained in the scriptures. He could have played their game and out-argued them on their own terms.
Yeah.
But he doesn't.
No, he doesn't.
He deploys a strategy that completely short-circuits their entire worldview.
He engages in what scholars refer to as the full speech in chapter 11. It is a sustained piece of biting, brilliant irony.
I love this part.
He essentially says, you want me to boast according to the flesh, you want a resume of my superiority. Fine, I will play the fool and boast. But then he executes this profound rhetorical inversion. He lists his credentials, but the credentials are a litany of absolute horrors.
He starts listing things that would make a Corinthian recoil in disgust. He boasts about being flogged. He boasts about being beaten with rods 3 times. He talks about being pelted with stones, shipwrecked 3 times, spending a night and a day floating in the open sea.
Just intense suffering.
He boasts about his constant danger from bandits, his sleepless nights, his hunger, his thirst, his exposure to the cold. It's like that CEO we imagined at the beginning, standing at the podium and reading their worst failures. He is literally weaponizing his own trauma. Why does this work as an argument?
It works because he is redefining the mechanism of divine power. In the Greco-Roman world, to claim that a humiliated, physically broken, suffering leader is the actual conduit of divine authority was utterly scandalous.
It makes no sense to them.
Right. To understand the mechanics of his argument, the survey points us to 3 crucial Greek words that really form the conceptual spine of the entire letter: thalipsis, paraklesis, and dynamis.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of those terms, starting with thalipsis.
Thalipsis translates to affliction, trouble, or pressure. But it's not a light inconvenience. The etymology carries the imagery of physical crushing, like grapes in a winepress.
Ouch.
Yeah. The super apostles argue that thalipsis was evidence of failure. Paul argues that thalipsis is the normal, expected environment for a genuine messenger of a crucified God.
The survey frames this beautifully as apostolic conformity to the suffering Messiah. He isn't suffering because he's failing. He's suffering because he looks exactly like the leader he claims to follow.
Exactly. And it's within the crushing pressure of thalipsis that the second word becomes active: paraklesis.
Which means?
We often translate this as comfort or encouragement, but we shouldn't think of it as a soft, sympathetic pat on the back.
You're not just there.
Right, no. In military contexts, paraklesis is the exhortation that fortifies a soldier to hold the line. It is an active, strengthening intervention by God.
Oh, I like that. Fortification.
And crucially, Paul argues that he receives this paraklesis not just to feel better, but so that he can be the conduit of that exact same fortification to others who are being crushed.
And the culmination of that process is the third word, dynamis, power, where we derive the word dynamite.
Right. The super apostles thought dynamis looked like health, wealth, and rhetorical dominance. Paul argues that true dynamis, the very power of God, can only be visibly authenticated when the human vessel is undeniably weak.
Because if the vessel is strong,
Exactly. If the messenger is flawless and powerful, people will attribute the transformation to the messenger. If the messenger is broken and unimpressive, the power must clearly originate from God.
which brings us to perhaps the most famous, debated, and deeply personal metaphor in the entire letter, the thorn in the flesh in chapter 12.
Ah, yes, the thorn.
Paul admits that he was given incredible, transcendent spiritual visions, but to keep him from becoming arrogant about those experiences, he was given this thorn. He begs God 3 times to remove it.
And God's response is basically the thesis statement of the entire letter. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.
But the maddening part for historians is that Paul never actually tells us what the thorn is.
No, he doesn't. And that ambiguity has driven centuries of scholarly speculation.
What are the main theories?
The theories generally fall into a few categories. Many argue it was a severe physical ailment. Based on passing comments in other letters, some suggest it was a debilitating eye condition.
Because he mentions writing with large letters elsewhere, right?
Exactly. Or perhaps recurring bouts of malaria, which was common in that region, or even a severe speech impediment, which would certainly explain why the super-apostles mocked his speaking ability so relentlessly.
A speech impediment would be fascinating, considering he was operating in a culture that absolutely worshipped flawless oratory. It would be the ultimate vulnerability.
It really would. Other scholars look at the phrase, a messenger of Satan, that he uses to describe the thorn, and they argue it refers to external persecutors, specific individuals who relentlessly followed him from city to city to undermine his work.
Oh, like a human thorn.
Exactly. Still, others suggest it was a profound internal psychological struggle, a persistent temptation, or spiritual oppression.
The brilliance of the text leaving it unnamed is that it creates this universal access point. Anyone in any century dealing with a chronic, unfixable pain can insert their own struggle into that blank space.
That is so true.
What does the survey suggest is the most responsible way to interpret it?
The survey emphasizes that the safest and most accurate interpretation is functional, rather than diagnostic.
Meaning what it does rather than what it is.
Precisely. We may never know the medical or historical specifics of the thorn, but its function in the text is crystal clear. It was a continuing, inescapable affliction, deliberately permitted to restrain human pride, shatter self-reliance, and force an absolute daily dependence on divine grace.
He summarizes this entire worldview with a brilliant visual metaphor in chapter 4. He calls human beings jars of clay.
Such a powerful image.
If you go to a museum today, you see ancient clay jars behind glass, carefully lit. But in the 1st century, a jar of clay was the equivalent of a cheap, disposable plastic container.
Basically, ancient Tupperware.
Yes, it was fragile, unremarkable, and easily broken. The super-apostles were trying to be flawless marble statues. Paul says, no, we are just cheap clay pots, but we hold an infinite, radiant treasure inside us. The cracking of the pot is what actually lets the light out.
And that metaphor completely redefines authentic leadership. According to this document, leadership is not validated by spectacular displays of superiority or a perfectly curated image.
No.
It is validated by Christ-like sacrifice, total transparency about one's limitations, and the endurance to keep serving others even while carrying your own thorn.
But this radical embrace of vulnerability isn't just a clever debate tactic to win an argument against his rivals. It serves a much deeper structural purpose in the letter.
It does.
Accepting that you are a fragile, flawed jar of clay is the necessary psychological prerequisite for repairing the broken relationship with the Corinthians. You cannot reconcile with someone if you are both wearing impenetrable armor, refusing to admit any fault.
You just can't.
And that brings us to the profound theological core of the letter.
The theology presented in chapters 3 through 5 is some of the most towering and complex in the New Testament. The survey anchors our understanding of this section around 2 massive Greek concepts: kataloga, which means reconciliation, and kainiketesis, which means new creation.
Chapter 5, verse 19 is really the gravitational center here. God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. But to understand how radical that is, we have to look at the mechanism of how Paul gets there. He grounds this new reality in a deep dive into New Covenant theology in chapter 3, contrasting it with the Old Covenant represented by Moses.
The imagery Paul uses here is deeply embedded in the Jewish scriptures. He recalls the story of Moses descending from Mount Sinai after speaking with God. Moses' face was radiating so much divine glory that it terrified the Israelites, So Moses had to put a veil over his face.
Just to talk to them.
Exactly. Paul uses this historical event as a theological metaphor. He argues that under the Old Covenant, the glory was fading and veiled. But in the New Covenant, established by the Spirit, the veil is permanently removed. Believers with unveiled faces are actively being transformed into the image of that glory.
Now, when we start contrasting the Old Covenant of Moses with the New Covenant, we have to be incredibly careful. The survey makes a vital clarification here because this specific passage has, tragically, been weaponized throughout history to support anti-Jewish rhetoric.
It is a critical distinction to make. The survey forcefully clarifies that Paul is not engaging in anti-Semitic replacement theology.
Right.
Paul is a deeply observant Jewish thinker. The mechanism of his argument is redemptive historical fulfillment. He is arguing that the entire narrative arc of Israel's story, the law, the prophets, the covenants, always had an eschatological goal. It was always heading somewhere.
A destination.
Yes. And that destination has arrived in the person of Christ. He isn't canceling the old story. He is declaring that the story has reached its climax. The Spirit is doing what the prophets promised, writing the law not on external stone tablets, but internally on the human heart.
And because of that internal transformation, the individual becomes part of the kanaiknesis, the new creation. But here is the tension I want to push on.
Okay, let's hear it.
The theology is staggering. It's cosmic. But how does this text connect the grand abstract idea of the entire universe being reconciled to God to the incredibly messy, awkward, on-the-ground reality of the church drama in Corinth?
That's the real test, right?
Exactly. Because we know there was a specific individual in the community, the survey calls him the offender, who was a catalyst for the painful visit. This is the guy who publicly humiliated Paul. How does the theology of the new creation practically force Paul's hand to forgive the very guy who tried to destroy him?
That intersection of high theology and gritty reality is the genius of Paul's pastoral application. The survey points out a crucial dynamic here. Key doctrines in 2 Corinthians like pneumatology, the study of how the Spirit works, or soteriology, the study of how salvation operates, they are never left in the abstract.
They aren't just thought experiments.
No, they're directly embedded in the mud of pastoral conflict.
So Paul isn't just giving them a lecture on how people are saved in theory. He's weaponizing that salvation to dictate how they treat the guy who just stabbed them in the back.
The logic is inescapable, Paul argues. If God, through Christ, has bridged the infinite gap to reconcile rebellious, hostile humanity to himself, then the community that claims to be formed by that God must physically embody that reconciliation.
Can't just talk about it.
Right. You cannot claim the identity of a new creation while simultaneously operating under the old rules of holding grudges, demanding your pound of flesh, and preserving your honor at the expense of someone else. The leader is not a celebrity demanding a flawless reputation. They are an ambassador of reconciliation. Therefore, his instructions regarding this specific offender are breathtakingly radical.
The church, seemingly prompted by the severe letter, had finally disciplined this offender. The man experienced what Paul calls godly grief in chapter 7. We need to explain the mechanics of that. What is the psychological difference between godly grief and just normal, everyday regret?
The distinction is profound. Worldly regret is fundamentally self-centered. It is the sorrow of getting caught. It is mourning the loss of your reputation or the consequences of your actions.
I'm sorry, I'm in trouble.
Exactly. Godly grief, however, is an outward-focused recognition of the profound pain you have caused to another human being and to God. It shatters the ego and leads directly to genuine repentance and a desire to make amends.
The offender in Corinth evidently reached this point of godly grief. The community had punished him, and he broke. So Paul intervenes, and he tells the church to stop.
He does.
He says the goal of discipline must always be restoration, never permanent humiliation. Once the person repents, the discipline must immediately transform into overwhelming comfort.
It is the absolute antithesis of cancel culture.
Oh, totally.
In a performative, honor-shame society, if someone threatens the honor of the group, the social mechanism is to exile them permanently. You cut them off to preserve the purity of the community.
Right, you isolate the infection.
Paul short-circuits that mechanism. He says, no, we are the community of the reconciled. You must forgive him, reintegrate him, and actively comfort him, lest he be swallowed up by excessive sorrow. The theology demands compassion over retribution.
It's incredible, but Paul doesn't let the concept of reconciliation stop at emotional forgiveness within a single local house church. If this new creation reality is genuine, it has to become tangible, material, and frankly, global.
Right into the economics.
Exactly, which sets the stage perfectly for the final major thematic section of the letter, where the topic abruptly shifts to cold, hard cash.
We turn to chapters 8 and 9, which the survey identifies as focusing on the Jerusalem collection. Paul is organizing a massive, multi-regional financial relief effort.
And to understand the stakes, we have to look at the macroeconomic context.
We do. The Jewish believers living in Jerusalem were experiencing severe, grinding poverty. This was likely the result of documented historical famines in the region, combined with the severe social ostracization they faced.
Because they were essentially kicked out of the synagogues.
Exactly, which would have cut them off from local economic support systems. They were starving.
So Paul takes on the role of a logistical coordinator. He is traveling through his Gentile church plants, specifically in the Roman provinces of Macedonia and Achaia, where Corinth is located, and he is asking these relatively affluent Greek and Roman converts to raise a massive sum of money to send back to the Jewish believers in Judea.
The sheer logistical danger of this undertaking in the ancient world is staggering. He is proposing to gather a massive fortune in gold and silver coin, physically transported by foot and ship across the Mediterranean, navigating pirate-infested waters and bandit-ridden roads, just to deliver it to a city hundreds of miles away.
And raising money is universally awkward, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you're asking a community that you just had a massive fight with.
The worst time to ask for money.
But the psychological mechanism Paul uses to motivate them is brilliant. He doesn't guilt them. He doesn't command them. He reframes the entire concept of giving using two words. Charis, meaning grace, and koinonia, meaning fellowship or partnership. He points to the neighboring churches in Macedonia as a provocative example.
The Macedonian example is striking. Paul writes that the Macedonians were experiencing extreme poverty and severe affliction themselves.
We were broke, too.
They were. Yet they practically begged Paul for the privilege of participating in this collection, giving beyond their actual ability.
We have to contrast this radical, self-emptying generosity with the toxic Greco-Roman patronage system we dissected at the beginning of the hour. In Corinth, remember, gift exchange was a weapon of social control.
Yes.
If a wealthy patron gave you money, it was a trap. It established a rigid hierarchy where the receiver was eternally indebted to the giver.
I appreciate the analogy you used earlier, comparing patronage to a mafia favor. When the patron does you a favor, the unspoken rule is, you owe me absolute loyalty and I own your public honor. It was fundamentally self-serving.
You never really own the gift.
Right. Paul takes the economic engine of their culture and completely dismantles it.
He strips away the strings. Paul's vision of giving operates like an early, radical form of unconditional mutual aid. He tells the Corinthians that their giving must be entirely voluntary. It should be proportionate to what they have. It should be done cheerfully without compulsion. And the only debt created by the exchange is love.
The mechanism of this new economy is, once again, grounded entirely in Christology. Paul writes in chapter 8, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich."
Wow.
Christ's self-emptying incarnation becomes the exact, practical blueprint for how the church handles its bank accounts.
The ultimate goal here isn't just disaster relief, though. The survey highlights what Cambridge scholarship defines as socioeconomic solidarity. This was a concept that simply did not exist in the ancient world.
The concept of translocal solidarity was revolutionary. The idea that ethnically Greek and Roman communities living relatively comfortably in one part of the empire would willingly sacrifice their wealth for impoverished Jewish communities in a completely different province, purely out of a shared spiritual identity. That was unheard of.
It crossed every boundary.
They were refusing to absolutize their local advantage.
It proved that the gospel wasn't just a mystical philosophy or an abstract set of beliefs. It was a tangible socio-economic reality that possessed the power to bridge the deepest ethnic, geographic, and economic divides of the ancient world.
It was proof of life for the theology.
Exactly. This collection visibly demonstrated the unity of Jew and Gentile, preparing the theological ground for his later magisterial arguments in the book of Romans about the one unified people of God.
It is the ultimate proof of concept for the new creation. If the theology doesn't change how you handle your money and how you view the marginalized across the world, it isn't real.
We have covered massive ground today. We've traced the history, the heartbreak, the archaeology, and the soaring theology of this incredible document.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. Let's pull all these threads together for you, the listener, as we wrap up this deep dive. When you step back and view Velocis's survey of 6 Corinthians as a whole, what you are really looking at is a systematic deconstruction of a society obsessed with image.
It is a total dismantling of performative culture. The Corinthians valued polish, status, and the illusion of invulnerability. Paul arrives and insists that the architecture of reality is entirely different.
He proves that God's power doesn't operate through our curated strengths. It is perfected in our undeniable weaknesses. He redefines leadership not as the acquisition of power, but as a transparent, cruciform willingness to suffer for the sake of others.
Yes.
He demands that the cosmic theology of reconciliation hit the ground in the messy, painful work of forgiving the people who hurt us most. And he demonstrates that true grace must inevitably manifest in radical, no-strings-attached generosity.
It is really humbling to consider how this message survived. The survey briefly mentions Papyrus 46, or P46, which is one of the earliest surviving manuscripts containing Paul's letters, dating back to around AD 200.
Oh, wow.
It is a fragile, battered piece of ancient papyrus. But that broken vessel carried this radical inversion of values across millennia, preserving a text that speaks with piercing clarity directly to our modern age of social fragmentation and frantic image management.
We are, in the end, still just fragile jars of clay. We break easily, we carry deep flaws, but that is precisely the design.
Beautifully said.
So, as we conclude this deep dive into the source material, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to carry with you long after the audio stops playing. We spent a lot of time discussing Paul's thorn in the flesh, that unnamed, inescapable affliction that kept him grounded and forced him to rely on grace.
Right.
If the author of this ancient letter is actually right, if it is true that our greatest weaknesses, our deepest failures, and our most painful afflictions are the exact places where genuine power and profound human connection occur, what is the thorn in your own flesh? What perceived failure, what hidden weakness are you currently expending massive amounts of emotional energy trying to hide from the world? That might actually be the very thing you need to share to genuinely connect with the people around you.
It is a haunting and beautiful question. The very thing we are most afraid to reveal might be the only thing that can actually heal our relationships.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring the depths.